Okay, in today's class we are going to talk about the emergence of Russia, that is to say the emergence of Russia as a state actor on the European scene. So, we're first going to begin in about 750 or so, when a people migrated into the region, a people today we call the Rus or the Kievan Rus. They set up cities in this area. Actually, many of the city of Kiev and Novgorod were actually some of the bigger cities of the Kievan Rus. Moscow was also established, but it wasn't quite as large as these other cities. The word Rus originally is supposed to come from Sweden, and one of the pieces of evidence we have for that is this, that the modern Finnish word for a Swedish person is Rutsi. Estonian is similar, is Rutsi as well, and they believe that the word Rus or Russian, as it is today, originally referred to people who came from Sweden. You can see the expanse of Muscovy here on the map on the side, beginning as a small kind of duchy or kingdom, and it grows to the beginning of our period into a pretty substantial area. Okay, so born Temujin in 1162, he and his horse riding followers launched this empire, which dominated Eurasia for much of the 13th century. And the answer is, who is Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. So, in the middle of the 1200s, Muscovy or Moscow was one of several Russian-speaking cities in the area today we call Western Russia. It was attacked by the Mongols. It was subdued by the Mongols. But the rulers of Moscow eventually began to kind of collaborate with the Mongols, really, and in that way kind of built up their power base. So they grew wealthy in working with the Mongols, before they finally engaged in resistance to Mongol rule, fighting the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. And this battle is remembered today in many ways as the starting point of the Russian nation. It wasn't the end of Mongol influence. The Mongols actually still hung around, but it was a battle that the Russians fought and won, or that Moscow fought and won, I should say. And in many ways is seen as the starting point of the Russian nation. Mongol influence continues to fade after the Battle of Kulikovo, and in the vacuum that's created by the absence of the Mongols, Muscovy or Moscow begins to expand. And in the late 1400s, Ivan III establishes himself as the ruler of not just the city of Moscow, but he begins to call himself the Lord of all Russia. And that is to claim a kind of allegiance, not just from the people of Moscow, but from the other kind of Russian-speaking cities in the area as well. Okay, in 1453, this city fell to Mehmed II, bringing the final end to the Roman Empire. And what is that city? Well, it is Constantinople. And actually, just before the fall of Constantinople, the Russian Orthodox Church had separated from the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople. And in the wake of the fall of Constantinople itself, Moscow began to imagine itself as a kind of a new Rome, as a new great kind of empire to be kind of built up. Why did the Russians think they were the true heirs to the legacy of the Roman Empire? The question I'm asking. And if we were in class, we would pause here and none of you guys would get the answer, or at least rarely is the answer given kind of straight away. It was because just as Constantinople saw itself as the heir of Rome, and indeed continuing the legacy of the Roman Empire, now Moscow saw itself as carrying on the legacy of Constantinople, and ipso facto the Roman Empire, Rome itself. So in that way, that's how the Muscovites saw themselves as kind of a new Rome. Ivan the Terrible. Okay, Ivan became the first Tsar in 1547. And during his reign, he expanded Russian territory to the east and to the south. The first question I have is, Why did Ivan start calling himself Tsar? What does that word mean? And it's in connection with our previous slide where we talked about Russia seeing itself again as a new Rome. The city just as Moscow was carrying on the legacy of Rome, the ruler of Moscow should also carry on the legacy of the ruler of Rome, which was Caesar. So Caesar is Russian for Tsar. We also get the German word Kaiser from that word as well. So it's like Kaiser is a Germanization of Tsar. It becomes more prominent in the 19th century in Germany, and Tsar, of course, is the Russian for Caesar. Ivan the Terrible was called Terrible. The name doesn't really translate very well. In Russian, the Terrible kind of means kind of awe-inspiring, as opposed to in English, the terrible means just the dreadful, the awful. It doesn't have that exact same connotation in Russia. It's more kind of awe-inspiring. Ivan the Awesome, you might even call him. Although he actually was at the same time awe-inspiring, but also pretty terrible as well. So maybe it isn't totally unmerited. His rule was basically an effort at standardizing and centralizing power in Moscow. He creates a new law code. He creates a Russian parliament, which basically was a kind of rubber stamp act for his acts that he was bringing in. He brought in a national printing house, and also for the first time a standing army, a kind of army independent of the Russian nobles or boyars, and one whose loyalty was, of course, to the nation of Russia in theory, but to Ivan himself. And Ivan really was very worried about the effect of the military and its control in Russian society, or its lack of control, its kind of disloyalty to him. In 1564, after a disastrous war with Poland and Lithuania, in which he lost a considerable amount of territory in Livonia, modern Latvia, Ivan threatened to abdicate unless he was given power to kind of punish people without restraint, to punish traitors without restraint. And for a little while, the parliament attempted to govern by itself, but in the end, it backed down, and it invited Ivan back and granted him the powers that he wished to have. And then we saw something kind of more ominous in terms of his rule. Ivan certainly takes the territories of his nobles he considers to be disloyal. He always had a terrible kind of penchant for misrule anyway. As a young man, he had a noble torn apart by dogs. He had an archbishop tied into a bear skin and then fed to hungry wolves. His temper kind of comes out even more so in the 1560s, after he's been granted kind of uncontrolled power. He sacks the city of Novgorod and does brutal things to the population there. He even goes as far as killing his own son. Nobles suspected of being disloyal were one thing, but even his own son was fair game. The story was that his son's wife was dressed immodestly, in Ivan's opinion. And Ivan beat her, and he beat her so bad she actually lost her baby. And Ivan's son, who was also called Ivan, confronted him, and he bashed him on the head. And this is a kind of an artistic interpretation of that. And the artwork here kind of seems to show Ivan striking his son dead, but kind of realizing that in doing so he had actually made a dreadful mistake, and one actually that was of severe consequences for Russia, because with the death of Ivan in 1585, there was a great deal of instability came in. Ivan had two sons, Ivan Jr. and Fyodor. Once Ivan was dead, the crown passed to Fyodor, but the problem with Fyodor was that he was actually kind of intellectually weak is a generous term for it. We would actually say maybe intellectually disabled today. And he also was kind of incapable of producing children. So he did rule. Ivan Terrible died in 1587. Fyodor did rule for about 10 years, and then then died as well. But it was the vacuum created by the death of Fyodor that caused real problems. Firstly, it was the end of the Rurik dynasty, and that dynasty had ruled Russia going back as far as the 800s. Or sorry, not ruled Russia, but had ruled Moscow. So it really was a long-lasting dynasty that came to an end with Fyodor's rule. But the time of troubles was a time of great instability in Russia. There was a large number of false claimants to be the Tsar. In fact, the throne exchanged hands 6 times in that period. Russia was invaded and devastated actually by a Polish-Lithuanian army. There was a famine in Russia that caused about a third of the population to die. And so really from 1598 to 1613, a great deal of hardship and unsettled kind of feelings and political instability until a new Tsar was appointed. So the time of troubles end with the installation of this new and last Russian dynasty. What was this family's name? And the answer is the Romanov family. Michael Romanov became Tsar in 1613. The Romanovs were to rule Russia for another 300 years until 1917. Ivan the Terrible started life as a child, a fact that troubled his later personality. True that. Okay, so we're going to look at 2 Tsars today, Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great. And usually what I do in class is I put these pictures side by side and I ask people if they can spot the difference between the two. You certainly could say that firstly, in terms of their facial hair, Ivan has a big bushy kind of beard. Peter has a much more kind of crafted mustache, if you will. Ivan is wearing very kind of old kind of clothes. I mean, they're very kind of almost medieval in their outlook. Peter is wearing kind of more of a uniform, a military uniform. Ivan seems to be holding maybe a religious staff. Peter's holding a sword, and the basic essence of what I'm going for here is that Ivan looks very kind of medieval and Russian. Peter looks very Western, and that's actually very deliberate. That Peter the Great is going to be the Russian Tsar who introduces a lot of the Western kind of lifestyle into Russia. So that's why I had these kind of 2 guys put together side by side, because they're not exact heirs. There is a bit of time between, in fact, almost a century between Ivan the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and Peter the Great. But by looking at them side by side, you can see the kind of different worldview that both men had. Okay, so Peter transforms Russia politically, socially, economically during his reign. In particular, he is going to put a big emphasis on the need for Russia to westernize, to kind of catch up, and to kind of look westward for inspiration politically, culturally, socially. And in some ways, he marks the beginning point of the great debate in Russian society about whether Russia is a European Western nation and should kind of follow in the norms of the rest of Europe, or if it's something kind of apart and separate and different and should maintain that sense of difference from the West. And that's not just kind of speculative talk. Even in the 21st century, that debate is very much front and center in Russia, especially in the 21st century around the issue of gay rights, that a lot of people see gay rights as a kind of Western invention, a Western creation being imported into Russia, where nobody actually is gay at all, according to the defenders of this position at least. So just saying that, just to give you kind of some kind of context for this this kind of ongoing debate that's been taking place since the time of Peter the Great. So Peter initially became Tsar in 1682. He was barely 10 years old. Peter the Great's father was Alexis. Alexis had two wives, a first wife and a second wife. And after Feodor III died, so Feodor was older than Peter and he ruled, there was kind of a debate about who should take over from Feodor. And obviously the wife of his first, the family of his first wife wanted that brother to take over. The wife of the family of his second wife wanted their son Peter to take over, and Peter, of course, was the wife, or was the son of the second wife. They kind of reached a compromise where Peter would rule alongside Ivan, his older half brother. But really they were governed by their half sister Sophia, or Peter's half sister, Ivan's sister. And she managed to set up a kind of her own kind of regency in the palace for several years. We have the dual throne here of Peter and Ivan, and you can see the box at the back it's cut out, and that's actually where Sophia used to stand to give advice, to pass on messages, and in many ways to govern herself in the name of Peter and Ivan when they were kind of younger children. So that was the position of Peter. In 1696, he finally is able to take control of Russia by himself. Ivan had died earlier on, and he finally overpowers Sophia and kind of has her locked up, and he's able to become the sole ruler of Russia. He's abnormally tall for his age, so Peter the Great is almost 7 foot tall. He's known for not really kind of conforming to noble kind of, he thinks noble kind of behaviors and are a bit too snobby. So he likes to kind of have a rough and ready image of himself. His second wife was actually a Latvian peasant. He's also known for carrying out executions himself with an axe, again conveying this image of someone rough and ready and willing to get his hands dirty when he needs to do so. Okay, in 1697, Peter, and this is having just secured the throne of Russia, travels to Europe looking for allies. What empire do you think he wanted to get allies to fight against? And the answer is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire borders Peter's to its south, or his south. He has aspirations to kind of conquer the Black Sea. Russia is not really on the Black Sea at this stage. Most of that land is held by the Ottoman Empire. He aspires to conquer some of this land. And so he travels to Europe to find allies. He goes to Prussia, the Netherlands, and England in particular, trying to find allies to help him in his war against the Ottoman Empire. Peter himself has a great time. He lives it up. He parties kind of rather wildly. So much so that he kind of, some of his hosts are kind of intimidated or find it incredulous that this kind of giant Russian who has these kind of insane parties is in charge of an enormous empire back east. In England in particular, they destroy the house they're staying in to the kind of chagrin of their neighbours. But he also wants to learn from the West. And in some ways, he for a time, he also travels incognito and gets a job, for example, in the Amsterdam shipyards, working on ships, fitting ships, and learning about Western style of navigation and shipbuilding. And he comes back from his trip in 1698. He doesn't have any allies, but he comes back having learned a great deal about the West and wanting Russia to emulate the West. Now, I don't know how often his disguise worked. I don't know if anyone noticed a giant Russian working in Amsterdam shipyards and kind of thought, oh, that's just some guy, and didn't know it was Peter the Great. But he certainly learned a great deal from them. One of the things he began to appreciate was the need for a flag. So here we have the Russian flag, but Peter was actually inspired for this flag by the development of, or the creation of, another nation's flag. In other words, he saw this other nation's flag, he liked it, and he wanted it. And so I'm going to ask you to kind of think about what flag was he copying. People usually say France, but actually the French tricolour that we know today did not come along until the 1790s. So it's not France, but it is the Netherlands. that Peter was inspired by instead. So Russia gets a new flag, or at least allegedly. We can't be 100% sure of these things, but the Russian flag develops around the time of Peter the Great, supposedly inspired by the example of the Dutch. He comes back to Russia and he wants to make Russia as Western as possible, or certainly a lot more Western than it is. So he orders Russian nobles to shave their beards. So again, in that picture we saw him with a mustache. That's very much the style he's looking for. To wear Western clothes, to adopt Western languages. French and German are very kind of popularly promoted during the reign of Peter the Great, so much so that in the 19th century, it's much more common for the Russian nobles to speak, at least in court, not in their day-to-day lives, but in court, to speak French or German than Russian. And also to wear Western style clothing. You can see this image here on the right of a man, presumably Peter, maybe not Peter, but grooming or shaving these large Russian beards. Also, the Western clothes, Russians wore big kind of long hanging sleeves in particular, and he wanted them to cut those back as well, so to dress more Western. What do you think Peter could do to discourage men from growing beards? What could anyone do to discourage men from growing beards? Well, he introduced a beard tax. So if you had this token here, you would pay the beard tax and you were good to go. If you didn't have that token and you were caught with a beard, you were likely to be shaved on sight. Another question, what could Peter do to help close the gap in scientific and technological knowledge between Russia and the West? Well, he could set up an Academy of Sciences. He could promote science and technology, not just by founding this Academy of Sciences, but more importantly, by encouraging skilled foreigners to move to Russia, to bring in their kind of skills and talents, and to teach other Russians the length of their trades as well. So engineers, carpenters, etc., to come east and to train Russian engineers, etc., in order to pass these skills on. He also ordered a Russian translation of a book of etiquette for European or for Russian nobles to follow. He wanted Russia to have very much of its own style. In terms of, or not its own style, adopt a Western style of etiquette and table manners. And so this book was very important for Peter, and he expected Russian nobles to adhere to it. In fact, he ordered many Western books translated, and as a sign of how kind of religious Russian society was, prior to Peter, there were only 3 books in the Russian language that didn't deal with religion or some kind of religious topic. That is a law book, a grammar book, and a military book. Peter orders all kinds of books to be translated, even books that we might be surprised, such as, for example, the teaching of John Locke, which would kind of go against the kind of absolutist style of rule that Peter was following. But Peter felt that too much Western knowledge wasn't a bad thing, and so he encouraged all kinds of ideas, even the ideas he didn't actually agree with. And of course, he built a new capital city in Western Russia, in the very edge of Western Russia. He builds a new capital city, St. Petersburg. It differs from Moscow in that Moscow is kind of a medieval style city with streets kind of going hither and thither and small narrow alleys. St. Petersburg, on the other hand, is broad boulevards, well planned, well maintained squares, crafted gardens, everything you kind of would expect to see in a modern Western city. And of course, St. Petersburg is modelled on other European cities as well. Why did Peter call the new city St. Petersburg? On the one hand, you would think, of course, it's named after himself, and of course, on some level, it is. But it actually also reflects the influence of the influence of Europe here as well. St. Petersburg is actually a German name, and in terms of St. Petersburg, it's a German name. Berg is a German word, so it has this name St. Petersburg for a long time. It becomes, in the First World War, Petrograd. Why does it become Petrograd? Because Petersburg is suddenly too German. The Russians are fighting against the Germans in the First World War, so Petersburg is out, Petrograd comes in. After the First World War, of course, Russia is now a communist state. The city changed its name again to Leningrad, and remains Leningrad for much of the 20th century, before eventually reverting to St. Petersburg again, and that's what it's called today. But it has this kind of evolution of names over time. Okay, east of the back of the beyond were the Russians, who knew nothing at all during this period. A factor in this was their use of the kinetic alphabet. They meant to say Cyrillic alphabet, the kinetic alphabet. In Russia, the 17th century was known as the time of the bounding of the serfs. So yes, the Russian serfs were bonded, not bounded, bonded during the reign of Alexis, that is Peter's father. They kind of emerge as a class and enter into debt and become serfs. But I like the idea of the bounding of the serfs as these kind of people frolicking on the savannas or the wild grasslands of the Russian plain and Russian steppe, bounding about excitedly and happily. Russian nobles only wore clothes to humour Peter the Great. Peter filled his cabinet with accidental people and built a new capital near the European border. Border, of course, is misspelled. Orthodox priests became government antenna. Okay, this is where we would read our primary source document. I'm not really going to go into that. But the document was another example of Peter copying Western traditions. Peter, it was issued in the year 1699. He said that on January 1st, we're going to switch our years. We're going to basically say, here's a new year. It's going to be the year 1700. Because in the Russian calendar, using the old Byzantine calendar, it was actually the year 7207. It wasn't 1699, it was 7207. The new year started also in September. Peter was saying we're going to switch to September or January 1st, 1700, and that's going to start a new Western style approach of adopting the calendar. And that was his main influence there. Of course, at that very time, there was actually reforms going on in the European calendar elsewhere. In fact, the Europeans, most of the Europeans, were just beginning to adopt the Gregorian calendar at the very time that Peter adopted the Julian calendar. In other words, Peter adopted the calendar just as it became out of date and maintains that calendar up until the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. So that's why when we get to the October Revolution, you have, it's called the October Revolution, but actually in most of the Western world, it took place in November. And other things, there's also an effect in 1908, the Russian team for the 1908 Olympics showed up 12 days late for the Olympics because they were going off the Julian calendar rather than I won't say rather than our modern calendar. I'll tell you, and I'll explain a little bit about where this calendar difference emerges from. So, measuring time. After growing confusion about dates, he introduced a major calendar reform in 46 BC. Who's the answer? You should get, of course, Julius Caesar, the Julian calendar. So, a Roman year used to be 355 days long. And every 2 or 3 years, they would insert a kind of a short month, an intercalary month, between February and March. And that would, over time, at least when the system worked properly, it would average out to about 365 days and a quarter, give or take. The problem with the intercalary month was that it was the pontifices in ancient Rome who would decide whether it should be inserted or not. And sometimes, or not sometimes, quite regularly, this was the pontifices was a political office, and if their allies were in other political offices, it would, on the one hand, behoove them to extend the calendar year, so they could be in office longer some years, or when their allies are not in power, it would suit them to not include an intercalary month. So the Roman calendar over time actually became very out of whack with the tropical calendar. And that's where Julian calendar came in, and they basically said we're going to set a calendar of 365 days and a quarter with a leap year every 4 years. How long was the longest year in history? It was 46 BC. How many days long was it? 445. Because, of course, once they decided to reform the calendar, they then had to wait for the new year to come around again before they could actually begin and introduce the new calendar itself. So 445 days long. Because it was 10 days out of sync, the 13th Pope of this name ordered the calendar to be reformed in 1582. So the Julian calendar, and I guess I should give it the answer here, was Gregory the Sixth. Do you remember at the beginning of the year when we did that math problem and I said to everyone I wasn't going to ask you guys to do a math problem anymore? Well,
I lied.
Okay, hopefully that played the I lied soundbite. We do have another math problem here. The problem with the Julian calendar was 365 days and a quarter. That roughly balances out, but even then that's not exactly precise enough. And what happens is every 400 years the calendar adds 3 days or so. And so by the 1580s the calendar has added about 10 or 11 days. That's why Pope Gregory the 13th introduced the calendar reform and set up a better system. So what did Gregory do? So if the Gregorian calendar becomes 3 days out of sync every 4 years, how can the calendar be kept in sync? So that's the difference that Gregory introduced. He found a way to manage these 3 days every 400 years. How can the calendar be kept in sync? Well, the obvious answer is you got to get 4 days or 3 days to disappear. How can you make 3 days disappear every 400 years without anyone noticing? Because obviously days mean something, and if days go missing, people are going to kind of ask questions. Gregory's answer was quite simple. Every century year, so we'll say 1600, 1700, 1800 is a leap year. On 3 of those years, so that is say 1900, etc., we're going to remove the leap year. So the calendar will be held, but there will no leap year will be held. So that's to say 1600 should have a leap year, and it does have a leap year. But 1700, 1800, and 1900, which are supposed to have leap years as well, at least according to the calendar, do not have a leap year in order to keep the Gregorian calendar in check. And that's how you get the system to work. Back to the Gregorian reform. So Gregory XIII introduced this in 1582. What countries do you think refused to implement it and why? And the answer, of course, is, well, it was primarily Protestant countries refused to implement it, and of course, because it was a Catholic invention, they didn't really like it, despite the fact actually it made a great deal of sense. So for much of the 1600s, Europe has 2 calendars, a Protestant calendar and a Catholic calendar. It's only actually in and around the year 1700 that most of the Protestants drop the Julian calendar and adopt the Gregorian calendar. And of course 1700 is exactly the year when Peter the Great is introducing not the Gregorian calendar but the Julian calendar, the earlier Julian calendar, into Russia. And so from the very beginning the Julian calendar reform is actually out of date. What the last country in Europe besides Russia to stick to the Julian calendar was England. In 1751, England finally decided to adopt the Gregorian calendar. It also shifted its New Year's Day from March 1st to January 1st. That meant that the new year, or 1751, is the shortest year in history. And how long was 1751? The answer is 282 days. Okay, so that's a lot. That's a kind of major sidetrack on the calendar and explaining how we got to where we got in the Gregorian calendar today. Peter continued the power of his predecessors in increasing the power of the Tsar. So he was not an unusual Tsar in that sense, that he was increasingly centralizing power in the person of the Tsar during his reign. He expanded the army, He also founded the Russian Navy, and Russia didn't have a navy prior to Peter the Great. It didn't really have any kind of ports. But Peter introduced, by conquering on the one hand some areas in the Baltic Sea, by making St. Petersburg his capital as well, he brought a kind of an aquatic way of life, or an aquatic worldview to Russia's kind of imperial domain, and therefore they adopt a navy as well. He brings in commanders to teach Western military styles, Western military weapons as well. The flintlock musket or rifle is introduced, and he kind of modernizes the Russian army and navy. In 1705, Peter introduced a military conscription, that every 20 households would produce one conscript. And this was his effort to create a standing army as well, a large standing army for Russia. So a standing army is basically an army that is permanently on call, because most of medieval warfare had been fought. Nobles would gather their own men in times of crises and come to the aid of the king, but that meant that the king didn't really have control over his army. So a standing army is a way for a monarch or a czar to get a much firmer control over a national army, as it were, as opposed to relying on nobles to lend him soldiers. He also put the Orthodox Church under his control. When the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church died in 1700, Peter didn't replace him. He instead formed a Holy Synod or Council to govern in his place, but really, of course, it governed with his will. And so he's extending his religious control over Russia in that way. And no criticism of Peter was tolerated. I mean, there were 4 major rebellions during Peter's reign, and all of them were put down brutally. For as Western as he was and enlightened as he was, he also was quite aggressive in protecting his rule. And thousands of people were tortured and executed because of suspected disloyalty to Peter. Okay, naturally, this expense of the Russian army and the Russian navy came with a significant expenditure. In fact, he tripled state expenditure during his reign, Peter the Great, that is. And in fact, some of his greatest expenses were on the military. At most times, 2/3 of state revenues went on the military. So he needs to get more money. He begins to do things, and one of his ways of raising money is it comes up here. What rights can a government sell to businesses in order to generate revenue? What in particular would be an attractive right for any business? And the answer is he begins selling monopolies on salt, tobacco, even things like dice. So he begins selling monopolies on oil as well to pay for his military. So this military is expanded, it's impressive, it's modernized, but it's expensive. And Peter has to find ways of raising new taxes, and selling monopolies on to businesses was one way of doing so. He also, in order to promote a more efficient and effective leadership, he creates a table of ranks in 1722, connecting rights to state service. And this was, he was particularly in terms of ways of controlling his nobles. He divided the bureaucracy. We'll see here. What advantages do you think accrued to Russia and the Russian government by creating a table of ranks? A couple of major advantages accrued to Russia. Firstly, it encourages nobles to become better educated, because these are positions that require education, require an ability to read and write, and to be useful with numbers. It requires the nobles to actually learn to do these things. The more important one is that it also becomes based on a meritocracy. That is to say that if you're creating a table of ranks, Peter is basically saying that, okay, you can work your way up to the very top and increase your land holdings as you do so. So he's basically seizing the land of nobles and allowing them to hold it only on his sufferance, and in return they're expected to commit to a military career or a civil career or an imperial career. But the idea is that the people at the very top of this system are competent because they've been promoted the way up. So it's not just giving jobs for the boys, the people who kind of have the most influence or whose daddy is rich get the best jobs. Now we're getting the best jobs in the hands of people who are efficient, who are capable and competent to hold these jobs. So the military, the imperial service was divided, the state service was divided into three ranks: the military rank, the civil rank, and the imperial service. And then it was divided into 14 kind of levels or ranks, which had to be earned on merit. So you had to work your way up the system. You'd start at the bottom, naturally, and depending on your service, would work your way up to the top. And over time, as we already said, this allowed an educated nobility to be created, but also made room for commoners of exceptional talent. And there were cases of Peter coming across nobles who caught his eye through their kind of efficiency, to their kind of ability to be bureaucrats, basically, or to manage things. And they also could earn a noble title by working their way up through the table of ranks as well. Not surprisingly, not everyone loved Peter's ideas. His push for westernization angered a lot of church people in particular. The old dissenters were the old members of the Russian Orthodox Church who thought Peter had introduced basically a reformation by making them shave their beards and wear Western clothes. And certainly by some of the very obvious ways he influenced the Russian Orthodox Church as well, in getting rid of the patriarch and governing the church basically through a holy synod. The nobles didn't like these infringements upon their rights. I mean, they understood that in centralizing power, Peter was taking power from them. But dissent was not tolerated by the Tsar, even going as far as having his son Alexei tortured, and he died from torture in 1718 because he was suspected of being disloyal to Peter. Okay, so in the Great Northern War of 1700 to 1722, Russia faced off against this rival power. And the answer is, what is Sweden? So the Great Northern War, in spite of Peter's improvements, Sweden was still considered the dominant power in northeastern Europe. The Swedes governed the Baltic region. They were the dominant power in northern Europe. Russia was very much seen as an up-and-coming force, but not the leading elite power, certainly not the leading military power in northeastern Europe. And Peter kind of wanted to change that. He wanted to test his new kind of Russian military on against the Swedes, and an opportunity to do so came in 1700 when he decided to join an anti-Swedish alliance that included Poland and Denmark to attack the areas governed by Sweden. Initially, the war went very poorly. So in 1700, the Battle of Narva was fought, which is in modern Estonia. Disastrous defeat for the Russians, and so initially things conformed to plan, where the Russians show that they're second best to the Swedes. The Swedes, however, do not pursue the Russian army, and they're able to actually, within a couple of years, capture the area around St. Petersburg. I mean, they begin to establish St. Petersburg in the marshlands of the Baltic region in 1703. And then finally, the big battle in the war is the Battle of Poltava in 1709. So it's fought in actually today, essentially what is Ukraine. It's fought between Russia and Sweden, and the Russians earn a huge victory. That Peter's westernization efforts have paid off. The Russians are able to defeat the Swedes. The war actually continues for some time to come, but after 1709 it's very obvious that Russia is going to win, and that a new European power has been born, a new European power player has been introduced into the continent of Europe. Prior to this, Russia was never involved in any of the European conflicts, but now it's expanded, and by coming into the Swedish sphere of influence, it's also introduced itself to the European sphere of influence as well. Finally, in the Treaty of Nystad in 1721, so the Swedes under Charles XII continued to fight on despite the fact they were kind of hopelessly outgunned after 1709. Charles finally dies, I think in 1718, and the Treaty of Nystad in 1721 grants Russia the provinces of the Baltic, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. Essentially, are granted to Peter, drawing it into the European sphere. And by the time of his death, Peter had succeeded in making Russia a powerful Western nation. And actually, just to give you some figures to put into context, the Russian nation grew 6 times its size from the beginning of Ivan the Terrible's reign to the end of Peter the Great's reign. Most of their expanses, of course, is in the in the east, and in the south. Russia is 30 times larger than France, and France is, excluding Russia, the largest European state. So it's an enormous state that has now introduced itself into Europe, and is going to have a huge influence in the European continent going forward. So that, in some ways, is the great legacy of Peter the Great, and we will leave it there. So. Huh?
From my headphones.
Oh, it's a.